Chapter 15. From the region of floating mountains of ice to the island of white natives. "We'll have to dodge the hurricanes south of the equator this trip," said my father to the mate as we sailed out of Adelaide, South Australia, with a load of salt for the States. "With the dead weight on board of wet salt, it'll be too dangerous to try to outride the storms at this time of the year." It was April, just the beginning of tropic wintertime. By the time we had sailed south of Tasmania and had circled the South Island of New Zealand, which would take about 2 months, we would be right in the midst of the worst weather of the year. "We better get the foghorn out and the riding lights trimmed if you're going to take that South Passage, Captain," observed the mate. "Them fogs and mists from the Antarctic are mean beggars." I was soon to find out why the mate referred to the Antarctic as mean. Father had set a course around the southward of Tasmania. For 3 weeks we sailed with fair wind and clear skies, and then the fair wind gradually changed to a stinging sharpness. The skies misted up in a sort of transparent fog, and mirages appeared on the horizon. Mirrored against the indefinite horizon were 2 islands with tropical foliage seemingly floating in space. The mirage is a dangerous thing to mariners, for it confuses even the most careful navigation. "Joan, you ain't much use. You go on the fossil head and turn the foghorn. 3 short blasts a minute, then 1 long one," said my father. "Are you afraid of running into another vessel down here?" I asked. "Not a chance of sighting even a hunk of driftwood, but the marine law says we have to squawk a foghorn when we get in the iceberg region." I had never seen an iceberg, and I was over-eager to be on the lookout on the fossil head to sight the first one. Our foghorn was a contraption that looked like a big coffee grinder. It was green with tarnish and thick with rust. I took my position just port of the capstan and ground away. I was rewarded by a rasping grunt. It took all my strength to spin the handle around just to make 1 blast. In spite of the cold, I got very warm trying to make the 3 short and 1 long blasts come. Father came forward and watched me straining away on it. He grinned at my exhaustion and said he thought that would keep me out of deviltry for a while, or make me so tired that I'd be willing to sleep and give him a respite from watching me. The noise of the horn began to echo back at me in an eerie tone. I called to Father. "We must be near land. The echo is coming back at me strong." He dashed to the fossil head and peered into the thickening mush of fog. The sea was so still that every sound became magnified. In a few minutes the suck-suck sound of water washing against some bulk came to our ears. "Drop the topsails!" he bellowed. "Bring her around!" With a violent jerk the ship came up in the wind and stopped. Ahead of us, not more than 500 yards away, loomed a giant iceberg. As we watched it, it sank deep in the black water, and then, as if it were some living beast, it heaved high out of the sea. The swish of the water around it, the suction of its movements, made a dangerous current. We began to drift nearer to it. Our ship had no power except that of the sails, and the wind had dropped and left them limp and powerless. "Throw over the kedge anchors!" Father ordered. Kedge anchors are small and used for emergency cases. The men rushed aft and threw one over each side of the vessel. They gave weight and pulled us back from the drifting head onto the iceberg. For a few minutes they held, but the water around us was a seething mass of cross-currents. Other bergs, larger and deeper, were in the offing. We had run into a whole nest of them. A steamer could have backed away, turned around, and left the place of danger, but our ship was helpless to move. The bergs made deep valleys, and whatever wind there was cut off by their height. The water sounded as if it were boiling around us. The mate threw over a chip of wood to see which way we were drifting, but the chip just whirled around and went down. A typhoon would have been a welcome visitor then, for at least its wind would have carried us away. But just being becalmed, waiting for the jaws of the iceberg to finish us, was like a terrible nightmare. The cabin boy and the Jap cook crouched behind the galley, pale and shaking with fright. Father's face was set grimly. A frozen death awaited us. Things at sea seemed to take on human qualities. The perversity of the wind was the curse of some dead sea captain, and the baffling calms were from the souls of lost sailors. That nearest iceberg was like a sea beast gloating over us as its prey. "All hands on deck!" went the cry from father, and it was repeated down the fossil. The men came scrambling up, buttoning their oilskins and sou'westers around themselves closely. When they were all ready, father turned to them. "You've got one chance in 1,000 to get out of here with your lives. Throw overboard the cargo." In a flash the crew were tearing away the battens off the hatches. If the heavy cargo was thrown overboard, the ship would ride lighter and higher on the waves, and the impact from a smash would be lessened. The curses of the men in the hold as they chucked up sacks of salt beat a staccato on the still air. "Joan, you and the cook and the cabin boy load up the lifeboat. Put tins of hardtack, a keg of water, and a tarpaulin in it." With those instructions, he took his post at the fossil head and watched our ship go nearer the bergs. 2 frigate birds with long spiked tails hovered above. A frantic little mother carries her chicken bird flew around and around in a dizzy circle over the stern. And how father just waited! With each roll of the ship we came nearer. The crew worked throwing out the sacks of salt like men possessed, and the ship lightened. Father ordered the rope bumpers put out and 2 cork buoys lowered over the bowsprit to break the crash if we hit the iceberg. The ship wouldn't answer to the rudder, for the currents were more powerful. Just as we braced ourselves for the destroying collision, we were caught in an eddy that lifted us high on the water and sent our ship dizzily about 100 yards past the iceberg. Our relief was so great that we didn't mind the loss of cargo. All night long we drifted in the ice floes, miraculously avoiding being crushed by them. The following morning, we found ourselves afloat in a world of white icebergs and thick mist. It seemed as though we were at the end of the world. It was difficult for father to figure out our position, as there was no sun, and to navigate by dead reckoning was useless, as the log line couldn't register how much we had drifted in the cross-currents. For a week that continued. Breathless days and nights that were ghostly in those white canyons of frozen water. Sometimes in the night we could hear the screech of seabirds leaving the ice, then silence again. Whenever any real danger was upon us, my father used to whistle or sing, or play his old water-soaked violin. I asked him how he could be so gay when death was staring us all in the face, and he said, "Well, what the hell do you expect me to do? Bawl about it? Besides, if the crew hear me singing, they'll think there's nothing to be afraid of, and it keeps their guts from freezing inside of them." We sang often in the 2 weeks that followed as we were blindly picking our way out of the iceberg region. The first time the sun shone after that was about 300 miles southeast of New Zealand. A stiff breeze cleared the sky, and our sails bellied out tautly under it. "We'll sail due east, Mr. Swanson," father said to the mate, "and try and mate Pitcairn. I haven't been there for years, and I want Joan to see it." I have heard the name of Pitcairn Island all my life. Every sailor looks upon it as a haven for seafarers. From their descriptions, it was the one perfect spot on earth, free from worries, money, and work. Old Stitches used to tell me about Pitcairn and its qualities of a paradise, but I thought it was the ravings of a mind that had too much liquor and too many girls in port. "What are we going to see on Pitcairn?" I asked my father. "White natives. It's the only South Sea island that has a tribe of English-speaking, light-skinned inhabitants." I was thrilled at the prospect of visiting Pitcairn, for white people were more of a curiosity to me than natives. As our ship nosed her way across the sea towards Pitcairn, I spent many hours listening to tales about that strange island from my father and 2 old sailors who had been there often. When Kipling gave to the world his much over-quoted lines, "East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet," he probably forgot that in the most remote parts of the South Seas, East and West had met, and had formed a race of people, living in a high degree of civilization and in a community almost free from sin, to disprove his theory. I looked up the island on the chart, and found it marked there with an inconsequential dot, and flaunting the austere name of Pitcairn, 23 degrees south latitude, 120 degrees west longitude. By latitude and longitude, I can locate a spot on the ocean as accurately as a landlubber can find 42nd Street and Broadway. Father saw me studying the chart and observed, "On the approach from the southeast, the island looks like a cone of rock jutting up out of the sea. Sometimes mariners call it Neptune's thimble because of its resemblance to a thimble in shape."
How did anybody get on a rock island so far away from the big island groups?
I asked. "I'll tell you, Joan. 'Cause I think you ought to know the whole romance of Pitcairn. Lots of folks has written about it, but none of them know all the facts like we sailormen know."
Have the islanders been there forever? I wanted to know.
Nope. You see, in the year 1789, His Majesty's ship Bounty was sent out from England to the South Seas to gather breadfruit trees for the purpose of transplanting the same in the British West Indies. In command of the Bounty was a tyrannical, overbearing taskmaster, a regular S.O.B. His name was Lieutenant William Bligh, and the crew was afraid of him, and at the same time they hated his guts. For months there had been a seething undercurrent of revolt brewing in the Fossil, and it was led by the ship's carpenter, a Mr. Christian. They laid their plans carefully for mutiny, but they bided their time until the Bounty sailed into the vicinity of Tahiti.
What good would it do to mutiny in the South Seas?
I asked, for I knew that escape in the islands was almost impossible for a white man fugitive on English possessions. "Huh," snorted Father. "Those bastards were so sore on old man Bligh they didn't give a damn what became of him, just so as they got rid of him and his officers." And from Father I learned how the White Native Island was founded. When Mr. Christian learned from one of the officers that the Bounty was about 200 miles off Tahiti, he gave the signal for the mutiny. With more daring than the pirates of the Arabian Nights, the crew mutinied. They bound and gagged the captain and those officers that were loyal to him, and set them adrift in the open sea in the ship's cutter which they had provisioned and watered. Christian assumed command of the Bounty and her mutineers. The abandoned captain and officers drifted for weeks through uncharted, shark-infested waters. They circumvented a dangerous coral shoal to land on what appeared to be a fertile, uncharted island, only to be driven from there by the cannibalistic inhabitants. After a time, their supplies ran short, and they subsisted on turtle, sun-dried fish, and saved the raindrops for water. Bligh was stricken with a peculiar malady from the strain and exposure. His officers had to save his life because he alone knew how to navigate, and that little cutter had to make some port soon or their goose was cooked. They didn't dare land on any of the islands that weren't charted because they might run into a nest of cannibals again. Nowadays we have charts and surveys of the islands, but in 1789 a lot of those atolls were never heard of. They had to get some fresh water and food for Bligh or he'd die on them, so one night the officers put into an atoll island and stole some fresh fruits and coconuts to nourish him. Weeks drifted into months, and at the end of 5 months they reached New Guinea, a distance of 3,500 miles from where they were set adrift. From New Guinea they secured passage on a trading schooner to Australia. Lieutenant Bligh lost no time in informing His Majesty of their predicament. Some time later he was rewarded by being appointed Governor of New South Wales. Indignant upon learning of the mutiny of his sailors, King George ordered HMS Pandora sent to the scene of the rebellion. In the meantime, the Bounty was cruising around the South Seas looking for a place to land and at the same time avoid capture. 14 of the Bounty crew who had mutinied went ashore at Tahiti and took up native lives in preference to being stretched by the neck by His Majesty's officers if they were caught. Besides, those 14 men preferred a life among beautiful native girls to that of hard work on shipboard. They used poor judgment, however, for the officers of the Pandora found them and took them prisoners. They were chained like dogs to the stanchions of the ship, and put on rations of bread and water. The Pandora set sail for England, where a death penalty would have been dealt to the mutineers, but she struck a submerged coral reef and became a total wreck. That reef is now known as Pandora Reef on the charts. While the Pandora was smashing to pieces on the sharp reef, the officers tried to get away, but they made no attempt to free the prisoners from their chains, and they left them to a miserable, slow death. They didn't give them the fighting chance that the mutineers had given Bligh and his men. Christian had sailed the Bounty to Ruatu. His men grew so restless and lonely that he advised them each to take to himself a native wife. Fascinated by the white skin of the sailors, their peculiar clothing, and strange language, the young native girls looked upon them as gods and showered them with gifts of fruit and flowers. Mr. Christian, acting in the capacity of a minister, conducted the ceremony, and each man became husband to a native girl. The chief of Ruatu had a daughter, Lowell, of unusual beauty, who offered herself to Christian. This so angered the old chief that he was planning to exterminate every white man of the crew, along with their native wives who had set a bad example for his Lowell. His plans were frustrated in their inception because Lowell loved the lily man, or he of the white skin, as she termed Christian, because he treated her with such kindness, such respect. To be treated with deference was a new experience for her, for native women have little or no importance in a tribe other than as creatures of convenience and producers of sons. Lowell brought news of her father's plan to exterminate them to her lily man, and Christian secretly deported in the night with all his men, their native wives and Lowell, whom he married. Christian had heard that the seas were being combed for them, and so he sailed far to the westward to escape his Majesty's forces. Just as our ship was heading now, the Bounty was heading. 1,500 miles south of the equator, and about the same distance west of the coast of South America, they came upon an uninhabited island. They had great difficulty in finding a way to land on the island, as there was no beach and the cliffs were almost perpendicular. Christian and a handful of men went ashore to explore the island's possibilities. On the east end they found a cove, overlooked by a plateau, which had the semblance of great steps up the side of the cliff, as if some sea giant had carved them for doorsteps to his castle. On the island top they found an abundance of fresh fruits, water in springs, and wild birds. Christian returned to the Bounty, called his people together, and impressed upon them that if they landed on that island, it was to be forever, as he intended to destroy the Bounty, and with it gone there would be no means of escape. With one accord the mutineers agreed to colonize the island of rock. They named it after General Pitcairn. The mutineers set about to strip the Bounty of all metal which they could use ashore. They set their supplies adrift on rafts to float inshore. Those who did not swim in went to the landing in small boats. When the last man had left the vessel, Christian lashed the helm amidships, headed her bow directly into the island, and deserted her. Gathered on the cliff of their new colony, the crew watched the ground swells of the Pacific wash the Bounty in toward the cliffs, until with a mighty crash she struck the wall and sank into the unsounded depth of the island. Gone forever was their hope of ever leaving, but also gone forever was any evidence of the Bounty to betray them into the hands of His Majesty's officers. Each man and wife set about and built a hut and portioned off a plot of land for a new home. Every variety of tropical fruit and berries grew in great profusion. There was more than enough of everything for everybody. But in spite of all that, it did not run smoothly on Pitcairn. Christian was chief. The Bible was the only form of government. The religion was and is to this day Seventh-day Adventism. In time, children were born to the mutineers by the native wives, and the children were white. South Sea natives have intermarried so much for generations that their blood is depleted, and the white man's blood predominated. The sailors called Pitcairn Eden, and rightly perhaps, because a woman was the cause of a quarrel which proved fatal to the whites. One of the mutineers, a Mr. McCoy, had sent his wife to gather seabird eggs from the rocks on the edge of a cliff. Losing her foothold, she fell 1,000 feet to the reef below and was instantly killed. As there was only an equal number of women and men, and all of them married, the mutineer, when he became lonely, took to himself the wife of one of the men. That so angered the husband that he killed his wife. McCoy became an outcast, and all the husbands looked upon him as a danger to their happiness. From that time on, dissension and intrigue flourished. Several of the mutineers set out on a small boat to find another island, and that left McCoy, Christian, a Charles Adams, and 7 other whites with their native wives on the island. The natives there now are the descendants of those families. Those whites and natives have a colony now without quarrels. They are industrious and God-fearing, but lockjaw is rapidly wiping them out. The mate came up to the poop deck where Father was sitting and asked, "Shall we give the Pitcairn Islanders some rope and canvas this trip, Captain?" We were only about 50 miles from Pitcairn, and by 9 o'clock that evening we would be hove to off it. "Yes, we've lost our cargo, so we might as well divide up our supplies." The Pitcairn Islanders wait months and months for sailing ships to come. Very few ships ever go so far off the beaten sailing tracks, and when one does, the islanders offer up a devout thanksgiving. Along about 9 o'clock, Pitcairn loomed ahead. On the top of it fires were burning. First they appeared on one end of the island, then on the other. They had sighted us. The fires were beacon lights to us, so that we would not strike the shoals by sailing in too close. "Give them the freedom of the ship when they come aboard," Father instructed the mate. "These natives never steal anything." Within an hour from the time we hove to, 3 boats from Pitcairn were alongside, and about 35 islanders came on board. I studied them closely for signs of native blood, but they were as white as I am. They spoke English simply and with a peculiar accent. The women were delighted to see me, another white woman. One old dame stroked my hair. A young girl offered to trade her native fiber dress for a pair of overalls. We went up behind the companionway and swapped the clothes. She thought she made a grand bargain as she strutted around in my faded blue overalls. She ran down on the main deck and brought back a tall, quiet young woman who seemed to be revered by the natives.
"This is Frances McCoy, who is saving our people."
Miss McCoy placed both hands on my shoulders, a custom of greeting probably inherited from her native maternal ancestors.
"Did you have a peaceful voyage?"
she asked, her voice quiet and smooth.
"No. We had the goddamnedest trip we've ever had. We struck icebergs south of Tasmania and had to shoot our cargo of salt to hell."
Miss McCoy turned away from me quickly and looked off to sea, but didn't speak. McLean, who had heard me talking, came over to her and said, "They never swear on Pitcairn, skipper," he explained. I had offended her. On Pitcairn, gentleness rules and cursing is against their law. I couldn't see at the time how people could express themselves without cussing, but anyhow I watched myself with a terrific strain in my following conversations. The young native girl in my overalls asked me,
"Have you any books to give us?"
I was surprised that white natives could read, but I was anxious to make amends for my swearing, and asked her and Miss McCoy to come down into the cabin and help themselves. The only books we had on board at that time were books on navigation, a doctor book, and a partial set of Encyclopaedia Britannica with those volumes from N to S missing.
"You can take all of these," I told them, "and the books on navigation, and the charts if you want them."
Miss McCoy grabbed for the doctor book. "My people are being wiped out by lockjaw," she said, "and I am studying medicine from books that passing ships give me so that I can cure them." That was why she was so revered by the natives. She was to save their lives. "For years our people have begged nails and canvas and ropes from ships so that we can get enough material to make a ship to sail away into the mainland. I am going in to get medicine, and I will bring it back here to stop the deaths caused by lockjaw. There is a kind of thorn, which when it pricks a person gives him lockjaw," she explained. No wonder Frances McCoy, the descendant of a pirate and mutineer, is looked upon as a saint here. Out of gratitude for the books and charts I gave them, the 2 women gave me a beautiful screen made of skeleton leaves, painted with the juice of wild berries, and a small chest of carved coral. After our bargain was made, we joined the others on the hatches on the main deck. One of the descendants of Christian was asking about the war. "In the Bible, we read of far-off countries going to war against each other. Is England at war now? A sailing captain of a German full-rigged ship stopped off here about 3 months ago and said he would never again trade with us." I hadn't heard anything about the war that I could understand. I knew that the price of copra had gone up because soldiers' foods were preserved with copra oil, but it was just as indefinite in my mind what war was as it was in the minds of the natives. Then the conversation skipped from war to music. One of the men asked if we had an organ to give them.
"What the hell is the use of an organ in the South Sea Islands?" I asked.
The hell had slipped out, but young Christian answered before anyone noticed it. "We had one, but the salt air has rusted it, so now it will give no music. Next time you come here, will you bring us another organ?" I guess the Pitcairn Islanders thought in America we could pick organs off trees or something, so naive and sincere were their requests. At about midnight, Father told the natives they would have to leave. Sadly they departed, begging us to sail to them again, and thanking us for our gifts to them. A Pitcairn Islander, when he is making a trade, doesn't drive a bargain like regular natives. They put down a commodity such as 2 bunches of bananas in front of you, and then they say, "I have made you a present. Now please, you will make me a present." It is our cue to give them a present in return, and if it doesn't meet with their approval, they take back their present and say, "I do not make you a present." I was triumphant as we sailed away from the island of white natives. I had a dress instead of overalls, feather fans, the screen, and a box of coral. Father was leaning against the spanker mast, watching the sails belly out in the wind when I went up to him.
"Hey, look, Father! All I got just for a few old charts and books."
And I displayed my treasures.
"Charts? What the hell are you talking about?"
he shouted.
"I gave them all the old charts I could find below, and the books on navigation. They gave me all these things," I explained.
He didn't stop to hear more. He took me by the back of the neck and almost carried me down to the cabin.
"Now what did you give them?"
I pointed to the empty place where all the charts had been.
"How in the hell can I navigate now?"
he shouted. This sounds calm as I write it, but Father was not calm. His face was blue, he was so mad.
"I've heard you tell the sailors lots of times you were so good at navigating that you didn't need charts," I answered.
I was sorry a moment later I had traded away my overalls for that native dress, as the dress was no protection for the rope's end that tattooed my behind. I got a licking, but Father to this day has never bragged about his navigating abilities where I could hear him. But he was too stubborn to go back to the island for his charts. He had to steer by dead reckoning the rest of the trip. After that visit to Pitcairn, I could see why everyone who has been there wants to go back. Maybe I'll go there again someday myself. I have heard since that Frances McCoy finally got off the island in a boat which took the natives 3 years to build to America. She landed in Seattle, where she began to study medicine as she had dreamed. However, within 3 months of the time she landed in Seattle, she died a pitiful death of brain fever. She was not accustomed to the noise and confusion and strange life of cities, and it struck her down before she could obtain her ambition of mercy.